Welcome to this state-of-the-art session on regulation of digital platforms. My name is Massimo Motta. I'm a professor here at Universidad Pompeu Fabra in the Barcelona School of Economics, and I'm particularly delighted to be the chair of this session. Actually, maybe I shouldn't say so, but I had not planned to come to the EEA conference. I was supposed to be on holiday. But then the organizers asked me to chair this session, and I think it was too difficult to say no, because today we really have not only an interesting topic, but we have two stars who are here with us to share their research and their thoughts about this topic. So let me tell you first the rules of the game. So first, we will have Jean Tirole, who is going to speak for 50 minutes, and then Chiara Ferronato is also going to speak for 50 minutes, and then hopefully there will be time for a quick session of question and answers. So let me introduce the speakers. Part of the rule of the game for this state-of-the-art session is that we have two already established researchers, but one who is slightly younger than the other. I will not tell you which is which. So let me start with Chiara. Chiara is an associate professor at the Harvard Business School, and her work has already made a very significant impact on empirical I/O and more generally about what we know of digital platforms, online commerce, etc. She has a number of publications in Top 5, in Management Science, which is the most important journal for somebody who is working in a business school, and others. She, among other things, she's also looking at regulation in connection with digital platforms and online commerce and others. So basically, her presentation will be about regulation in the context and the framework with digital markets and regulation of digital platforms. So we are really looking forward to this. So the other speaker is Jean Tirole, and I think I will not say much about that, certainly not about Jean as a researcher. Just to give you an idea, and I'm sorry that I'm revealing his age, but Jean turned 70 earlier this month. You wouldn't say that just looking at his productivity. So just for curiosity, I looked at his recent CV, and he has 7 or 8 top 5 publications just in the last 5 years. But what I want to say about Jean is that Jean does several jobs. So he has one job as a researcher, and I mean, you don't need to get to know more about that. But he does also several other things, and all with a lot of generosity. And one of those, for instance, is that he is an institution builder. And of course, he has been president of the European Economic Association and of the Econometric Society, and he has contributed quite a lot to both of them. But, of course, the Toulouse School of Economics is, in a way, is a child of his friend and unfortunately passed away too early, Jean-Jacques Lafont. But Jean Tirole has had a huge impact for the development of the Toulouse School of Economics. 35 years ago, the Toulouse School of Economics was not on the map, and today is one of the most significant players in economics in the world. So this is another job that he has. But then there is another one, which is his job as a mentor and as somebody who has been extremely generous to students and to young colleagues. I was also at the receiving end for all these years that I have known him. I just want to share with you an anecdote because I realized that this happened exactly 30 years ago and at a European Economics Association meeting in Helsinki. So I was presenting a paper in an invited session, and at some point, you know, at the beginning, Jean was sitting in the front row, and for somebody who was, you know, a young scholar, Jean Tirole was Jean Tirole even 30 years ago, so for me it was very important. But then, you know, after a while, he started to write on paper, so he was busy writing during all my presentation. And I must say, I was like, well, this is not something that you would actually do. So at the end of my presentation, he came and he apologized and he said, look, I'm really sorry. I have to go. I don't have the time to talk to you. But here are all my notes about your paper. So this is Jean Tirole, and who has always been very generous to a lot of people. Finally, and that is also the last thing that I want to mention, is that, and this has increased after receiving the Nobel Prize, he has also another job, which is of somebody who is doing a lot of work in terms of outreach and on policy. And part of what we are going to learn today is precisely about that. So he will share today with us some of his thoughts about economics and how economics can be used and what are the challenges for economists to think about digital platforms. Please join me in welcoming first Jean and then Chiara to the stage. It's going to be a treat. Thanks to both.
Well, thank you so much, Massimo, for those extremely kind words. You started well when you said I was just a little bit older than Chiara, but then you disclosed, unfortunately. But anyway, thanks a lot to the association, to Francesco and others for having those state-of-the-art sessions and for the privilege of being associated with Chiara. I'm going to do the state and she will bring the heart later on. I'm not sure I'm going to do the state if I don't know how to. Okay. When I was a little bit younger, I learned I/O, and in I/O I learned that we had to regulate utilities, public utilities. We had to use antitrust. I never learned about industrial policy because it was a source of shame for the family. But the technology has changed a little bit with AI and the platforms, and a number of neglected topics. I mean, by the way, it's true in every field. You know, there are fads, and then we say, oh, we have worked too much on that, it's all well known, and then you discover 10 or 20 years later that actually we don't know very much about it. Platforms, you might say, it's like public utilities, low marginal costs, very high fixed costs, very high network externalities. So what's different? So that was one of the things, and then there's, of course, now the comeback of industrial policy that I would like to develop, but probably I won't have the time to develop. And there are many, many challenges, and some of them are actually related to agreements about among potential competitors. And antitrust authorities and we economists are worried about either too much cooperation or too little cooperation or competition, as you want to call it. So too much cooperation, we know that we need to build public goods in this ecosystem. And we build public goods starting with R&D, and maybe with R&D joint ventures, or maybe through the states, through industrial policy. But then once you have innovation, we have to agree on standard setting, we have to agree on sharing of intellectual property through patent pools and cross-licensing. We have to create data pools, maybe, engage in some collective negotiation. There might be common ownership and so on and so forth. Now, all of those are fine, except that they may be used for the wrong purpose. They may both be efficiency enhancing and also violate the Section 1 of the Sherman Act, or Article 101. So we need some guiding principles. So I don't know if you can see, but I have two things in my slide. So one is in blue and one is in red. So what is in red is what you're going to do. So we need some guiding principle and, if possible, some information light rules. I mean, IO economists have been criticized quite a lot for saying, it depends on exactly the elasticity and this and that. And, of course, you may have the data for that. Maybe we won't have the data for that. But, by and large, if we can find information light rules which do not consume too much information about the details of the market, that will be much better off. But, the antitrust authorities will be much better off. Okay, I realize there's been some problems with my version of PowerPoint. I hope it's not going to create too much trouble, but yes, it is creating some problems already. And I'm sorry about that. So this is a simplified, just imagine, don't look at the picture. This is a simplified version of a two-sided platform. So in the middle, you have the platform. It has 200 names, like in the EU, it's called the core segment. In the old times, we would call that an essential facility, or whatever. This platform, this core platform, is going to bring together, facilitate the interaction between some consumers and some merchants or some apps. Some of them will be internal to the platform, so there will be vertical integration. Some of them will be not so integrated. I'm not going to talk about the relationship with consumers. That's the issue with many pieces of legislation in Europe. Most recently, the DSA on content curation, but there's been many things on the quality of recommendation. Do they serve the consumer? And so I'm not going to talk about that. This is very important, but I'm going to focus more on the contestability part. So contestability is: do you think that the next Google or the next Amazon or the next Facebook will be able to replace those giants? And for that, of course, there are conditions that you have to ensure exist. And then there is the issue of fairness and fair compensation, that the business side, the third-party apps and the third-party merchants actually are going to, will they get fair access to the platform? And even if they get fair access, will they get a fair compensation for their contribution to the platform? Okay? So the Chicago School is actually basically saying, don't worry about that. If there is any discrimination between in-house merchants and outside merchants, then that must be used to some efficiency motive, because the platform actually will gain by giving access to superior applications or merchants, those who bring more value than the in-house app or merchant. And the reasoning for that is that if you get a better ecosystem, you can sell this better ecosystem at a higher price to consumers. And this story has many issues with it. And the first one you can see just from the sentence I issued here, which is that you can sell at a higher price. In the digital economy, most of the prices are zero. If the prices are zero, which I will call the zero bound, that means that you would like to charge a negative price to attract even more people. And if you want to charge a negative price in the first period, you cannot do that because of arbitrage by bots or by consumers. If you cannot do that, that means you may not want to raise the price in the first place, even so you have a better ecosystem. So you already see one of the flaws in the argument in the Chicago School story. There are other flaws. One is that you may use discrimination against superior merchant apps in order to erect barriers to entry. That's called the app barrier to entry. And the final issue, which is a little bit more subtle, has to do with another zero bound, which is that often most of those apps, again, in the digital world, actually you have zero price as well. And again, if you have a zero price, that means there is no competition between third-party apps or limited competition between price competition between third-party apps and in-house apps. And that's going to imply that third-party apps may actually make a supernormal profit, and then you might want to foreclose them. Okay, I hope it's going to be okay for the rest. So that's what I was going through. I hope the mathematics will be fine, otherwise I'll be in big trouble. And I will have to convert fast into PDF, which is going to take time. The DMA in Europe, and there are similar legislation in preparation for the US, basically emphasizes two things. One is preservation of contestability, and the other one is fair access, in particular by business users to the thing. So here are the challenges. I'm not going to cover all of that, but two of them will be related to what I just said, which is how do you implement the DMA in Europe or the equivalent in the US in terms of contestability, in terms of fair gatekeeping. Then there will be three, I chose them, and there are others, of course, there are other things to do. One is on data ownership. The other one is on best price guarantees. They are called most favored nation clauses, and collective agreement. And if I have time, and I doubt it, I will be talking about industrial policy, because it's coming, and I don't think the authorities are realizing that they have to do it properly, and probably they won't. Executing DMA. Contestability, as you all know, is that if you have a natural monopoly segment, then you want more efficient providers of that segment to be able to enter and replace the incumbent. If Google slacks off, you want someone else to come in. If the prices are too high, if there's too much exploitation, then you want, in the case of Google, that will be prices to advertisers, prices to businesses, and so on, not to consumers. And you want to reap the benefits from a superior entrant, but even if you don't reap the benefit from a superior entrant, you keep the incumbent on its toes, so it will have to innovate, it will have to charge low prices to benefit from network externalities and so on. So what are we concerned about? So contestability is great, but we are worried that an efficient entrant in this core segment might not be able to enter. Or might be able to, but actually will not enter because it will be bought out. So that will be an entry for buyout. And that's what defensive mergers are about, where the incumbent is buying a potential rival to avoid competition. Okay, so protecting liability. The DMA view is that you should prohibit tying between core services and competitive services. And that's quite reasonable, and it's going to be also an issue with fairness. Then multi-homing. So there are a bunch of provisions in the DMA encouraging multi-homing, because multi-homing is very, very important for entry into the core segment. So imagine, it's a fictitious example, that you have Uber competing with Lyft, and Uber says, oh, all my drivers now must be with Uber, or they have to quit the Uber ecosystem. Now, what will the drivers do? Well, given that most consumers are on Uber, they will go to Uber. They will stay to Uber. That means that Lyft will lose a lot of consumers, and Lyft losing a lot of consumers, and basically it will snowball into a monopoly. So multi-homing is very important. In that case, multi-homing by the drivers for Lyft and Uber, but more generally it's very important for contestability. For networks, in particular social networks, we want to have interoperability. And that's very important. That's in the DMA, so we want those networks to be interoperable, both statically and dynamically. But that raises a number of questions. And in particular, who is going to set the standards for interoperability? So you need APIs if you want to, application programming interfaces, if you want to have interoperable networks. And that's going to be an issue. Another issue with my slides is that they are being cut, so you don't see what you should be doing next. What you should be doing next is to try to think about who is going to write those APIs. Is it going to be Facebook, the dominant network, for example, or is it going to be a standard setting organization? Is that going to be the government, and so on? That's the kind of thing which is going to be extremely important if you want to have competition in those markets. Okay. Then there is this controversial rule in the DMA, which is that you have to have data silos. So what we are worried about is that on the data market, Google and Facebook, I should say, Alphabet and Meta, are basically a data duopoly. And of course, they are going to dominate a lot of things, given that they have much more data than the others. And that's really an issue. Now, the idea is now will be to prohibit Facebook from using data from Instagram and WhatsApp, or Google from mixing data from Gmail and YouTube and whatever. It's all right, but then we lose lots of the benefits of combining different data sets. So your search, for example, might not be as efficient if other kinds of data about you are not part of it, right? So we need to find a way, you will be finding a way of avoiding those efficiency losses. You know, so again, the spirit of it is quite nice. But then how do you implement it is important. And then we'll go back to multi-homing if we have time. Banning most favored nation clauses is going to, most favored nation clauses really mean that you have a price guarantee. If you have a price guarantee, that means all prices are the same. And therefore, the consumer is not going to search. For example, you know, if you're on Booking to look for an hotel room in Barcelona, you're going to see the price on Booking. Actually, Booking is not a good example because Booking has been prohibited from using MFNs. But you look for through Booking for an hotel room in Barcelona, you're not going to look anywhere else because you'll find the same price. But of course, that means that if you're a Booking customer, then you are single homing on Booking, and Booking can, I will come back to that, can go and see the hotel provider and say, look, those consumers are unique customers, and therefore, if you want to reach them, you really have to go through me and pay those huge amount of money. Okay? So the second thing in DMA is that we want to prohibit defensive mergers. So it's complicated because you don't quite know what the defensive merger is. And probably if you think about Facebook buying Instagram and WhatsApp, which were social networks, they probably were defensive mergers to avoid those other social networks to actually come in and compete with Facebook. Now, how do you prove that? It's impossible. You just cannot prove it because there was no data. It was just at the start. They were basically differentiated and so on. Nobody will ever know. And that's a more general issue, which is that when you have an early mergers, often the firms which are being acquired haven't sold anything yet. And there's no data. So how can you do econometrics with that? And how do you know whether it's substitute? Anyway, you don't know where the firm, it's a young firm, where it's going, what the trajectory will be. So under the DMA, you will have to notify your acquisition if you are Google or Facebook. And of course, the issue is whether we should not just reverse the burden of proof. Right now, it's European Commission was actually to bring who has the burden of proof, but this is almost impossible to prove anyway. So that's an issue, maybe a burden of proof in which the dominant platform has to say, no, look, this is not dangerous, and actually their efficiency gains will be better. Now, just another question for you. Standard antitrust focuses on substitutes. So the SNP test, for example, which is used, or any kind of approach is basically looking at substitutes. But we know something from those industries in general. You don't come as a substitute, very rarely. You come from the side. You come as a complement, maybe even, So just remember Microsoft and Netscape, Internet Explorer versus Netscape. Of course, you are too young to remember, but you know, that war was basically, the story was a Netscape was a complement which could have become a substitute. And it's a very, and you know, again, WhatsApp and Instagram were not perfect substitute for Facebook anyway. You always come from the side, but then, you know, what are your criteria? It's good actually to create complement to an ecosystem. That's what you would like to do. It's actually very good. But then, you know, if they are purchased, what may happen is actually you may end up with killing the competition. Okay, that was in red. No, oh no, this is terrible, I'm saying. So the efficiency defenses are offered by big tech. They say, oh, we are purchasing talent. We are, well, you know, sure, but anybody can purchase talent. And you know, why should it be the one who is threatened by competition who actually is going to purchase the talent? Same thing, they will say, you know, if lots of the exit mechanism in venture capital is actually to sell to a big company. But again, you know, Instagram and WhatsApp could have been sold to Microsoft. I mean, you know, why should they be sold to Facebook, right? You might want to avoid double marginalization, but that's a little bit too fast. Can you avoid double marginalization through contracts or through other things like price caps and you know, who knows? And then there's the issue of providing a seamless experience, creating accountabilities. Fair enough, but that's something we'd like to know more about as well. Okay, challenge number 2, the fair access in open ecosystems. The common pattern in those industries is that the platforms operate markets, but they also compete in those markets. And you know, in general, you have a shade. You have 50 shades of openness or closeness. You have some pure brokers. So if you think about Airbnb or Booking, they are, in a sense, pure brokers. They don't own stuff. They are just a marketplace. You have some example of vertical integration, but even that, they are not perfectly vertical, as Apple being the standard example of that. And most of the stuff is in between. It's competition. So basically, you know, if you think about Amazon, just to give you one of the many examples, Amazon is both a marketplace, but also is competing in that marketplace because it's going to own Amazon Basics and Whole Foods and the like. Okay? And that's something that has attracted a huge amount of attention in the last 10 years, both on the theoretical side, on looking at the implication of vertical integration and foreclosure, and also on the empirical side, on self-referencing, and actually Chiara's work, she's going to discuss in a minute, belongs to that part. Because of course people are worried about self-preferencing. You know, is Amazon going to actually to favor its own products over third-party products, for example? Okay, so I'm going to discuss the access to gatekeeper, and you know, is that something that will go fine or not? Through some joint work I've done with, I'm doing with Michele Bisceglia, who is a student in Toulouse, and will be on the job market not this year, but next year. And what we do is to look at a very simple, it's the same as earlier, it's just a different drawing, two-sided platform with a gatekeeper for the access to consumers. So basically, there will be single homing by consumers. And that's going to be very important, as you're going to see. So the consumers will be connected to the core, or the platform, and the platform gives them access to in-house apps and rival apps. There will be a price P0 paid by consumers to the core. And we know that for most platforms, we pay 0, so P0 equals 0. You don't pay anything when you go to any of those services by Google. And then the in-house app will, and the rival app, the third-party app, will actually create value, V for the in-house app and V plus delta for the third-party app, where delta is positive. So delta is increment in value which is brought about by the third-party app. Otherwise, it's not very interesting. The interesting case is when there's a superior third-party app, and there will be 4 prices in this economy. So P0 is a price paid by consumer for access to the core. Then there will be a price P1 charged by the in-house app for the use of the in-house app, a price P2 charged by the third-party app for access to its app, and very importantly, there will be an access price. And the terminology comes from utility regulation, that, where this access price will be the price paid by the rival app for access. So typically, you'll be paying 2 or 3% if it's a payment card. You'll be paying 15% if it's Amazon. It might be 30% for Apple app, and so on. 20% for booking. So you pay something for access to the core and directly access to the consumers. Now, the first assumption, which is I put it in yellow, the first assumption is that you have single homing consumer. It's going to be very important. That means that the core is going to be a bottleneck. So the consumer, at least in usage, not necessarily in membership, but in usage, will be using one platform. The app providers or the merchants will have a negative marginal cost. And that's totally crucial for what I'm going to say, because everything I'm going to say relies on the zero lower bounds. And to get the zero lower bounds, in general, you will need some negative marginal cost. So it may be the case that once you have a consumer, you get some advertising revenue, you get some data that you can monetize, you get some merchant fees if you yourself have merchants on your own app. You can get follow-up revenue if it's a repeated game. And that means that we are going to capture by assuming that you have an ancillary benefit B per consumer. So anytime you get a consumer, you get a benefit B, okay? The value V is provided by app usage. So just for simplicity, it's not needed, but let's assume that the value comes from the apps, not from the core. You can have both. So that's the same mixed up diagram. Oh God, the Baumol-Willig rule has taken a beating. But you know Baumol-Willig by heart, I'm sure. At least anyone who is over 70 will know it. So the Baumol-Willig rule, the ECPR rule, basically says that the right access price is a price that compensates the platform for losing a customer. So if the third-party app in this context, I mean, that was not in the time of the two-sided markets, but I just translated to two-sided markets. The third-party app, when a third-party app takes a customer away from the in-house app, then basically the access charge compensates the core of the platform for the loss. What is the loss? It's a price P1 charged by the in-house app plus the benefit that it will have gotten from serving the consumer. So A equals P1 plus B, okay? By the way, in the old time, any judge knew that formula. With a B negative here, it's a B positive, but basically any judge knew that formula in the good old time. Probably none of you, very few of you know that formula anymore, but this is a very standard thing. Okay? So I'll mention, it's called ECPR, just Baumol-Willig rule. The zero lower bound will come when you have prices which are zero. Optimal prices will be negative, but because of bots and non-serious customers, you cannot get into negative prices. So P1 positive means that I will call that the app zero lower bound, and P0 positive means that there will be a core zero lower bound. And very often both are actually binding. Okay, so why are they important? And the entire story will depend on zero lower bound being binding. They are very realistic. Most core services like search marketplaces are free to consumers. Most apps are free as well. And they are economically very important in this environment. Actually, when the model is so simple that actually when none of the zero bounds binds, the Chicago school works. So we actually made the model so simple that actually if you don't have a zero bound, so if the prices are positive, the Chicago school is right, which means that the access charge at the margin doesn't matter, it doesn't allocate, it doesn't have any redistributive consequence. It's basically passed through to the consumers. Okay? Passed through to the consumers, well, it's more complicated. Okay, so let me just say one thing. Let's look at the timing at the bottom. So you start with an access charge which is determined. So under laissez-faire, it's going to be chosen by the platform. Under regulation, it will be the regulator who is going to impose the access charge. Or it might be a mixed system where you set the access charge and the regulator may step in and say, no, it's too high. Okay? Then, at that point, if you have laissez-faire, you can always foreclose the rival. So you don't give access. So in the good old times, this was a big issue for public utilities. What you'll do is to deny, that was a stupid way of doing it, to deny access. It's more likely you will degrade quality for the entrant, for the third-party app. You make things incompatible so that you don't get a good access service. Now in the digital industry, you may downlist. So you just put this third-party app or this third-party merchant on the 5th page, and you are sure that they won't sell anything, right? So that's very important. You downlist, but you can have other things like selective access to fulfillment and so on. So you can have non-price, that's called non-price foreclosure, by opposition to price foreclosure, where you set the access charge so high that actually the entrant doesn't want to compete anymore. Then the firms set their prices simultaneously, so P0, P1, and P2, and the consumer is going to choose which platform to join, and if there's only one platform here, but also which app, whether they join the platform and which app to purchase. Okay? So this one seems almost all right. Okay, so the EQM, I'm going to show you what the EQM looks like, which is if the access charge is very low, a bit above 0, basically the platform cannot make much money by giving access. So if it can foreclose through non-price methods the third-party app or merchant, it will actually do so, because it will gain B when selling itself and A when it doesn't sell. So if B is greater than A, then you're going to use non-price foreclosure. And by the way, that's a case where the access charge, you can check, is below the Baumol-Willig rule. Then there is this range where you get efficiency. So the superior third-party app or merchant will be selling. If you change A, then the prices will adjust 1-for-1, and in the end there won't be any problem. The superior app will have the market, and the CPR will be satisfied exactly. Then there is a region where you start squeezing. The access charge is going up, and you squeeze the superior third-party app. The profit delta, which is made, which is a competitive advantage in a Bertrand situation, of the third-party app, is going to be eaten slowly as you raise the access charge until it gets to 0. But in the meantime, the price of the access is above Baumol-Willig, and then you get price foreclosure. And the two reasons, in this case, the two regions of inefficiency is when either the app zero-lower bound binds or the core zero-lower bound binds. So you see the importance of those zero-lower bounds. Otherwise, nothing will happen in this model. Okay? Now, what the platform will choose optimally in this model will be this access charge, which is on the right, where basically you squeeze entirely the profit of the third-party app, but allowing the third-party app to still operate. That you get the best of both worlds because you offer the best to the consumer, but you steal all the profit from the third-party app, which has been innovative. Okay? So we need let me. Okay. So in practice, there's a lot of talk about the regulation of the access charge. Access pricing is a norm, actually, in practice, but also the DMA also recommend a lot of friend access. So friend access, what is friend is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. It's a delight for lawyers because it's so vague that what is reasonable nobody knows, but yeah, so it's wonderful for lawyers. But you know, other than that, the idea is to actually kind of regulate those access charges. Also, it doesn't quite tell you how to regulate those access charges. Well, what we show in the paper is actually regulating the access charge at the ancillary benefit of the merchant, A equals B is actually an extremely good policy. So basically, you choose an access charge which is equal to the ancillary benefit of attracting a consumer. And that solves a lot of issues, including the issue of innovation investment. So if you squeeze a third-party app, there won't be any third-party app anytime you have any investment or R&D. So if you want to innovate, to have innovation and an investment, you need the third-party app to get exactly the value delta that you create in the ecosystem. And to do that, and other things as well, what you would like to get is to have an access charge which is equal to B. Now, the next challenge, that's a very simple rule. A equals B, it's hard to find easier than A equals B. Now, the question is, how do you implement that? And that's why I switch in red. That's for you to do, because it's going to be incredibly, incredibly important for the future of this industry, which is a big part of our economy, as you know. And you know, how do A equals B? You have to estimate what B is, and probably B is heterogeneous on top of that. So one thing which has been done actually in Europe with using the tourist test for payment cards is to try to directly measure empirically the value of data, the value of advertising, the value of merchant fees, and so on. That's one approach. It's difficult, but that may be the only one we have. We don't know. The other one is to use theory and try to elicit the B from using some kind of Nash implementation game or something like that, some kind of mechanism design to try to elicit from the parties the value of B. And you won't get any elicitation from the platform, as you might say. I mean, it's impossible. Don't look for it. But what you may want to do is to get you know, the users, the merchants, and the app providers actually to announce B. There's actually a very simple mechanism that works also, as I'm going to emphasize. It's very suspicious in some way, which is that you might have the app developer propose an access charge to the platform, and then if it's not enough, the platform can always foreclose. Then there is no monitoring of foreclosure. So basically, then in that case, the app provider has incentive to choose a minimum access charge, which is going to prevent foreclosures, which is A equals B. Now, this is more complicated than that, as we discussed in the paper. But you know, one of the things that if you can do work on that is going to be tremendously important. I insist, tremendously important for the future. Massimo, how am I doing? 10 minutes. So I won't do the 6. I'll say a few things about data pooling and privacy. This is also very, very important. Data is a new oil, but of course you have to refine it. And the question is, what do you do with it? So the first thing you can do with data is, of course, to basically use it for your customer relationship. So to a policy which is specific to a customer. So you put some cookies. I know who you are. because I read your emails and I read your queries and your search queries, and I read everything. I know everything about you. And then I also know your peers. So even if you go into the woods and you try to escape the internet age, I know who your peers are, and they also talk about you, and I know what they look like, and they're like you. So actually, I know a lot about you anyway, okay? And I can do that, do this for a number of things we're going to discuss, but it also may have broader use. I may want to get your data, not to manage my relationship with you, but also to forecast demand, detect macro trends, and so on, and create entirely new services as well. Okay, so the first one is I'm going to use the data to actually create targeted advertising, price discriminate, which is also worrisome because if I know everything about you, I also know about your willingness to pay, so I can extract your surplus. I can extract your behavioral surplus as well. So I've noticed that you are very impatient. You are present bias, so I've noticed that you don't have a clue about this particular market. You don't even know what a lemon is. And then I can basically sell you whatever I want. And that's not very nice as well. So there's a prime. And then, so I mentioned this exploitation of our cognitive weaknesses and internalities. So that's really an issue. And we can say that we are against it. And we are against it. But the question is, how do you discipline it? If you are regulators, how do you do it? Okay, 3 questions relative to that. Is data the right currency? So, the platforms, in a sense, are purchasing our data. That's one thing. And, it depends on what they do with it. I mean, personally, and you may disagree, I'm not too worried about targeted advertising because it gives me access to advertisements which I care more about than the random advertisements. Now, I can see some primes that may arise also, but that's not the worst, I guess, of all things. The huge agenda for you is actually to measure the willingness to pay for privacy. So we all know about the privacy paradox. We all say we are very worried about our privacy, and at the same time, I click. I want to know, what the outcome of the rugby game of the Toulouse team, and I want to know right away, and I click, and I accept everything. So, it's just, and I feel I'm very conscious about my privacy, and at the same time, if I just look at my own behavior, it's awful. So the question is, how do we reconcile the two? The preferences, stated preferences, and the actions. By the way, there are related findings, which is there is a very small elasticity to expansion in the scope of data collection. So there are a bunch of cases where the platform has expanded the scope of data protection. Very inelastic, unlike Xavier's stuff earlier. That's pretty inelastic. Is this a paradox? I'm not completely sure, actually. But for one thing, is impulsiveness plays a big role. We click because we want to see immediately. But also, by and large, I think the biggest factor is that there is a lot of incomplete information, both about what the platform will do with our data and also about all the partners of the platform. So you try to read what is there. It's unreadable on purpose. It's very opaque, and then you have to read the policy of all partners who are going to share those data. I think this is just broken. We have to improve that. Should platform pay with our data? We have a platform duopoly in the West, and this basically shows up basically in the data domain rather than the price domain. On the consumer side, there's monopoly power, of course, on the other side, but the monopoly power operates in the data market. So people like Eric Posner and Glenn Wild basically said, maybe we should do something like that. We should be paying the users. So that's fine. The platform may keep owning the data, but they should pay the users in cash as opposed to paying in kind. So instead of watching YouTube for free and using Gmail for free and so on, you'll be basically paying. Now, no, I mean, you'll be, they will pay for your data, I'm sorry, and then there is another issue about how you'll charge for the rest. The obstacle with that, the first is gaming. There's been some experiment, I believe, on actually getting into payment, but of course the bots come in. Whenever you have a negative price, then the bots come in immediately. And the pricing is very, do you know the value of your data to the firms? Probably not. Because you don't know what the firm is going to do with the data. You don't know whether they have substitutes. It's very important. And probably they will convince you that they have many substitutes for you. And so on and so forth. And what's the cost for you, actually, to provide those data? So there are issues with that. Finally, there could be consumer as owners of their own data. So basically, the access is given to the merchant and app on a case-by-case basis, or to the platform. So you go to the doctor, you can give your data to the doctor. If you go to Spotify or Deezer, you give all your data to Spotify and Deezer, but you do it on a case-by-case basis. They are owned by you, and blockchain, of course, is going to facilitate that. You will have to fill up the information only once, lower probability of hacking, lower transaction costs, and the information doesn't belong to the doctor, it doesn't belong to Deezer, and doesn't belong to Deezer and to Spotify. Okay. So that's all nice, but it doesn't solve the monetization problem. And sure, you have an interest. Doctor is a bad example in a sense. I have some vested interest in doctor knowing about me, of course, right? So the monetization problem is difficult. And then there's the issue, and is that in red? I don't. So slides. Basically, there's the issue about combining various data sets without allowing de-anonymization. And that's really, I know we now have techniques to avoid that. We put some noise and so on, but it's kind of difficult. So, there's a whole issue about how do you combine data sets, which is incredibly efficiency enhancing without avoiding de-anonymization. It's a real big thing. Okay? Then there's the issue about the other use about data sets, not to target a specific consumer, but basically to get more information about markets, about various new services that you could bring. And then you have two schools. People who say, oh, there's a law of large numbers. So once you have Waze as 500 people taking this route, that's enough. You don't need more. And so the 500 others can go to another GPS provider. Some other people will tell you, no, that's not clear. I mean, just look at the difference between Bing and the search engine of Google. Bing is very good when it's a very popular website, but when it gets into more a search which is not so usual, then Google is much better. So that means having more data is actually very powerful. There's a general view that GDPR favors large firms, and there will be a data barriers to entry, fixed compliance costs, the fact that we are more eager to give our consent to firms we know, so larger firms in general, and basically the obstacle to data resales, which have been put forth by GDPR, but which probably will favor and help Alphabet and Meta. Okay, so that raises the issue, and I will stop here, of data trust. We maybe, in principle, data are the ultimate public good. So we would like every firm to be able to use the data. Now, in the short run, that might create problem because we might be expropriating Google and Facebook because they might legitimately claim that actually they invested in those data and they have paid for those data. So there's an issue, but if you want to develop autonomous cars, delivery drones, and so on, all kinds of health innovation, it will be important to have data pools that are basically open to everyone, okay? So the question is, at what price do you buy those data? And that raises a huge number of issues, and again, if you can work on it, that will be wonderful. So that raises the same ideas as, some people have said, why don't we do the same thing as for essential patents standard setting processes? So basically, payment to data owners that is fair, reasonable, and non-discriminatory. Why not? The prime is, all kinds of questions like what data, what price, and I'm not sure what was about the bottom. I apologize, really. Okay, so let me just conclude, and then I'm sorry about this. You have missed this. So there are a huge number of challenges, and I don't have the answer, and already Massimo complained about that. I'm putting questions without putting the answers. But I trust you that you'll bring those answers. The bad news is that our duty is to advance our science, to give regulators hand up. But the good news is that it's really exciting time to be a theoretical or an empirical IO economist. So I hope many of you will pursue those studies, and I want to thank you for your attention and apologize for those terrible slides. Okay.
While the slides get put on the screen, I really wanted to thank you, the organizers, for inviting me to give this talk. I'm truly honored and humbled to be here, and I hope this will add to some of the context that Jean has described earlier. I will be talking about regulation in two different dimensions. One is the dimension that Jean touched on, really antitrust regulation of platforms. The other dimension is actually regulation with platforms. So how can we better leverage all of the information and the data that platforms have to try and improve existing regulation around, for example, consumer protection? Let me start, before going there, with a picture that I used to use about 10 years ago when I was a PhD student. This is actually Mark Fraser, who is the first buyer on eBay. He bought the first item on eBay. It was a broken laser pointer. And Piero Midyar was surprised that somebody would want to buy a broken laser pointer, but these actually highlighted the potential of exchanges that wouldn't otherwise take place in the absence of an aggregator that really aggregates these many fragmented buyers and sellers of goods and services. Fast forward just a few years, truly, and the image that we have of digital platforms is much more of a sort of an evil set of companies that are trying to maximize profits at the cost of consumers, the costs of third-party merchants, and so we have to rein their power in. And I'll be talking a little bit of both sort of views, but both of the set of analysis really starts from the fundamental characteristics that really identifies platforms. The way I see these digital platforms is fundamentally they are information aggregators. They really have a lot of information about the many agents that use them to create valuable exchanges between each other. For example, they know on the seller side who has a high cost, who has a low cost. Maybe they know it directly, or maybe they know it because they nudge sellers to tell them that. They may know who is a low-quality provider and who is a high-quality provider. On the buyer side, they may know who has a high willingness to pay for products and low willingness to pay for products, who has a high search cost and who has a low search cost. These are sort of vertical dimensions, but there's also a ton of horizontal dimensions. They know exactly, think about Uber, who wants a ride when and where, and who is available to provide that ride when and where. And so these huge amount of information can be used in a very valuable way, but if it's owned and retained by the platform to sustain an entrenched position, that's when it becomes important to regulate it. So in the first part of the talk, I'm really going to focus on how this information can be used to improve regulation, and regulation of one particular dimension, which is consumer protection. In the second part of the talk, I'll be focusing on antitrust regulation of digital platforms. So when these data and this information is actually contained and owned, confidentially owned by the platforms to really sustain dominant positions. Let me start with part one. The background for this part of the presentation is that most digital platforms enter existing markets. They don't sort of reinvent the wheel. They really provide rides to passengers. They provide accommodations to travelers. These markets are already subject to many forms of regulations, such as occupational licensing. You can't be a taxi driver if you don't have a medallion and you don't have the licensing credentials to provide those services. Some are sort of voluntary certifications, and others are health and safety inspections. Your hotels are often regularly inspected by health and safety inspectors to make sure that the food that they provide you is safe to eat, right? Why do we have this regulation? Well, we have this regulation because there's potentially a high level of asymmetric information between buyers and sellers of services. You want to try and allow users to at least distinguish between lemons and peaches, or if consumers have a hard time distinguishing between lemons and peaches, at least remove the lemons, right? And so the idea in a very simple sort of Econ 101 graph is that these forms of regulation, again, occupational licensing, health and safety inspections, are designed to try and increase the level of trust that consumers have over the quality of these goods, thereby pushing to the right the demand curve. These may come at the cost of increased barrier to entries. And so you may end up having sort of a shift to the left of the supply. And we're willing to incur that cost because, again, the benefit is much larger, right? Now, given that these forms of regulations already exist, we could simply extend existing regulation to online providers. So for example, we could extend safety and accessibility regulation for hotels to Airbnb hosts, or we could extend taxi medallion requirements for taxis to Uber and Lyft drivers, right? This approach, though, it raises many questions, but it raises at least three questions that I have something to say about. The first one is whether existing regulation is justified in the first place. Many of these forms of regulations were sort of designed decades ago when arguably we didn't have all of these online reputation that may monitor service providers' quality. The second question is whether fundamentally different supply, and I'll be very specific in what I mean by fundamentally different supply, warrant different regulation if it's beneficial for consumers. And the third is what other options are available to address asymmetric information that maybe were not previously available 10, 20, 30, 40 years ago. All right? So I'm going to go in order in answering, at least providing a partial answer to this question. It's not a complete answer, and there's a lot more work to do. Online platforms, I bet if I asked to raise your hand on whether you've ever used Airbnb or Lyft, there's probably not going to be many people who've never used this. So instead of asking that positive question, I'm going to ask the negative question. Who's never used Airbnb or Uber or Lyft or any of these platforms? There's one person. Okay. I bet if I ask this question in 5 years, even that one hand is going to disappear. What these platforms do that previously traditional service providers didn't, they track transactions and reviews, and they provide a new way to measure the effects of existing regulation. So even if you weren't interested in digital platform as an academic, actually these digital traces allow you to study traditional questions that you may have cared about. For example, the value of occupational licensing regulation in an online world. And so that's what we're doing in this specific context. We obtain data from an online platform for home improvement services that wishes to remain anonymous, and so we'll keep them anonymous. Think about a platform like Airbnb, but for plumbers, for electricians, for architects, and for interior designers, okay? And you may post a request for services, and conditional on these requests, there will be a bunch of people, these are all the co-authors in the paper, there will be a bunch of people who may submit, service providers who may submit quotes to offer that service. And there's at least a couple of interesting signals of quality here that are interesting for our purposes. The first one is the obvious one that you see in every online marketplace, reviews. You have the number of reviews, you have the average star rating. The second one is specific to this platform, and upon submission of licensing credentials by the service provider, the platform verifies those licensing credentials, and when they are verified, which takes some time, and we'll exploit that time variation, it's going to show a badge, a licensing badge on the service professional's profile so that consumers can choose as a function of all these signals, okay? And so because these licensing signals sort of occur not immediately when the service provider shows up and tells the platform that they have a license, but it happens after, when the platform has had the chance to verify this, we can sort of take advantage of that timing to look at whether licensing signals have value in changing consumers' choices of whom to hire, right? So we can look at the probability of being hired of an individual professional before their license is validated, right? Controlling for the fact that they've decided to submit that information, and after the license is validated. And at best, there's sort of a zero effect of these license validation badge on the probability that a professional is hired. Now, is it because consumers don't care about licensing, or is it because consumers don't care about quality? Well, not really. We can do exactly the same exercise on sort of the timing of submission of the first review, and actually we can see that the effect of an online review is actually very positive in increasing the probability that that given professional is hired. Does it mean that occupational licensing is useless? No, absolutely not. And actually, it can have pretty large market equilibrium effects, which we can exploit here because we collect, separately from the platform, we collect all licensing regulation information for these type of occupations and across all of the US states. And there's, you know, there's a lot of variation that we can exploit because an electrician is not regulated the same way in Connecticut versus Massachusetts, and an electrician and a plumber are not regulated the same way in the same state. So we exploit this variation, and this variation can be quite large. Sort of, we're talking about multiple years of schooling difference, multiple years of on-the-job training difference, multiple number of exams differences. And so we can exploit this variation, this licensing stringency, to sort of see whether, you know, these sort of demand and supply plot that I showed you before changes as a function of licensing stringency. And what is interesting to see here is that on the demand side, the hope that this demand would sort of expand and would be pushed to the left, that actually, at least in this online setting, doesn't materialize. There's no change in aggregate demand, and there's no change in customer satisfaction metrics, right? On the other hand, this licensing stringency does indeed constrain supply. It reduces the number of options that consumers are available to choose among, and it increases prices. Now, this leaves still a lot of open questions. Why? Because we still need to better measure quality dimensions that we should care about. Maybe we care about whether a consumer leaves a 5-star rating or whether they return to the platform, but maybe that's not the type of quality dimension that we care about when we sort of create occupational licensing regulation. And so we have to have a better way to measure those quality dimensions. And then, you know, we shouldn't conclude that we should remove all sorts of regulation. There's a ton of like types of regulation here that may have a different sets of costs versus benefits. So identifying whether school or on-the-job training, for example, have the largest net benefits is going to allow us to sort of improve the effect, the efficiency of regulation design. The second question along this dimension is whether fundamentally different supply warrant different regulation. And the background for this work is that existing regulation is mostly designed for professional providers, right? They're asking providers, you know, quite stringent sort of standard and safety checks. And so what that creates is dedicated supply, is supply of rooms that are available 365 days a year, right? If you open a hotel, it better be open all year long. And taxis who are available in approximately 8-hour shifts. So this is the type of dedicated supply that you have over time. You have this flat dedicated supply. But what do we know about many of these markets? Think about rush hours for taxi services, or think about peak seasons for travel, for the travel markets. Well, the demand is actually highly fluctuating, right? And so what happens when a market with highly fluctuating demand is served by fixed dedicated supply? Well, you end up with lots of travelers without accommodations, and those that manage to get accommodation are paying a really high price. And in other periods of time, you're going to end up with lots of empty rooms, right? And so what happens with the entry of Airbnb in this specific context is that flexible supply, they fundamentally allow the entry of flexible supply. Supply of rooms that sort of come in when demand requires them, basically, and sort of contracts when demand doesn't need them anymore, right? And so this creates large that's what we sort of estimate, large welfare benefits to consumers by expanding this choice set and reducing the prices in periods when demand is highest and dedicated capacity is sold out. So not only travelers that choose Airbnb benefit, but also the travelers who choose hotels benefit from this price competition and price reduction. Right? And so if this is beneficial, how should we think about adapting regulation to a mix of flexible and dedicated supply? How should we design a two-part regulatory system while maintaining fair competition? And in particular, how do we distinguish between flexible and dedicated supply? Because the moment you sort of create a two-part system, everybody wants to try and qualify as the low regulation type of provider, right? And so in some cities, for example, home sharing hosts, so the Airbnb hosts, are subject to fewer restrictions than hotels, but cannot rent to travelers for more than a few nights a year. So really, you sort of take advantage of the fact that these hosts can come in on periods of high demand and then contract otherwise. Or in other examples, ride-sharing drivers are subject to fewer restrictions than taxi drivers, but also cannot perform the same pickup and drop-offs as taxis. So these are examples of ways in which we can take advantage of the benefits of these new form of supply without sort of reducing the quality that we may require on a more regular and standard basis. The final question is whether we have other options to address asymmetric information. And that's because existing regulation often relies on experts' evaluations of providers' quality, right? But the important question is whether digital traces or forms of online reputation can at least in partially substitute for these experts, because these experts are costly. So we study this question in the context of restaurants, right, where health and safety inspectors about once a year in New York go and visit a restaurant for a couple of hours at most and try to sort of infer the hygienic conditions of these restaurants. This is highly beneficial, right, because they check whether there's mice, whether there's proper worker hygiene, whether the food is handled at the proper temperature, especially if it's raw or cooked. But all of us also rate restaurants online. And so the question is whether these forms of online ratings, sort of these form of sort of crowd monitoring, can at least partially substitute for these experts. There's some good news and some bad news, of course. The good news is that online reviews contain some pretty informative signals of restaurant hygiene. And when these informative signals of restaurant hygiene are provided to the consumers, right, when there is a submission of an online review that is extremely negative about dimensions of hygiene, that has the effect of driving demand away from those dirty restaurants. The bad news is that there's a ton of dimensions of hygiene that experts monitor, and online reviews, consumers don't have visibility on all of those dimensions of hygiene. And so we really cannot substitute fully an expert in the role of monitoring these restaurants. So the open question here is whether we can leverage, at least in part, this useful quality information to improve the regulatory monitoring. And what do I mean by that? Well, how can we achieve the same quality with less expert effort? Many of these cities are capacity constrained and budget constrained, or increasing the quality with the same expert effort, okay? The second part is more around antitrust, much closer to what we heard so far. And this is really not regulation with digital platforms data, but more regulation of digital platforms. I'm not going to give too much of a background on this, especially because Jean has already done a way better job than me. But really why digital platforms are different, it's the confluence of a bunch of things that makes bigger companies better. So they have marginal and distribution costs 0, strong economies of scale and scope. They may have increasing marginal returns to data and strong network effects. One of the big caveats here is that we're really talking about the big 5, right? They were used to call FANG, now it's MAMA with Meta and Alphabet. But we're really, really talking about the big 5 because in many, many other markets, the network effects benefits are unlikely to sort of more than offset all other values from horizontal, for example, horizontal preferences for different and competitive platforms. And so we're really thinking of treating these big 5, and if you read actually Jean's Nobel lecture, he mentions it there as well. We really need to treat these big platforms as public utilities and think about antitrust regulation as a different form of regulation. What is interesting to note is that, again, over the course of these 10 years, I think there's a somewhat general agreement that so far there's been under-enforcement of antitrust regulation, in particular for digital platforms. The question that we all have in mind is how much further out do we need to move the pendulum? And this is a conversation that many economists are engaged in. I'm not on Twitter, but if you go on Twitter, there's a lot of economists engaged in these conversations. It's a question that many policymakers are engaged in, and probably even your relatives at a dinner table are going to be talking about this oftentimes. I don't have a position on where do we need to move the pendulum, so hopefully you don't read in what I'm going to say as a sort of a strong view yet on where we need to move, but hopefully I'll give you some insights. Again, because of all the attention on digital platforms, it's an incredibly exciting time to study antitrust. But there's a question of how to do that, because we need more work quantifying the trade-offs of various policy recommendations. And platforms are information aggregators. That's what we've been talking about so far. So they have, in principle, plenty of data to look at. The problem is that I'm going to challenge you to try and knock on Amazon's door and ask them to use their data to study whether they give priorities to their products. The likely answer is going to be a closed door. And if they are willing to give you the data, even if they're willing to give you the data, you should actually question their motives, right, given the media attention and the policy attention that we have. So I've been sort of struggling with this question for at least a year and a half. And the answer that we came up with is, well, we need to get our own data. And so for the last year and a half, we've been trying to work to create a web browser extension. We call it WebMonk because it's sort of a chipmunk that collects web data. That is nothing more than an ad blocker. So many of you probably have ad extensions to their Chrome browsers or to their other browsers. It's an ad blocker. It allows academics to manipulate browsing experience, right? So an ad blocker, how does it manipulate your browsing experience? It removes the ads from your experience. What we do is, I'll tell you in a second, most of the presentation is not going to be based on how we manipulate the browsing experience, but what we can do is, for example, remove certain results from search results on Amazon and see how people react and compare them to a control group where we don't remove search results. We can also change the type of cookie setting choices that consumers are exposed to see whether defaults are as powerful as we fear they are. We can also track browsing behavior. So, for example, we can see whether somebody searches for a travel mag on Amazon, and we can see all of the results, how they are ordered, and the results characteristics online. And then we can prompt study participants to complete additional tasks. So, for example, we can ask them to share, previous information about them, their previous Amazon order history. We can ask them to complete intake surveys that allows us to ask them to do certain things. Now, this is IRB heavy, so that's why it has taken a year and a half. The technology is not as easy as I would have thought it is. And there's a stringent IRB requirements. So for example, all of the data that I'm going to show you next are based on the US because I cannot do anything in Europe because of the GDPR. But one of the important things is that we truly hope to make these extension open licensed soon. And so if you're willing to do some of these studies, please consider using that. The other thing that I should mention is that actually, as part of the DMA, academics and researchers can request data from some of these large companies. And so that's also another way in which we can start accessing data for empirical analysis of these type of platforms. So let me show you the very first application of WebMonk. This is a very sort of more of a proof of concept of a study. It's not, I kind of hate having the name self-preferencing in the name because it sort of potentially misleads people to interpreting our results. But here it is. It's out there and we cannot change that. As part of this study, we recruited participants through Facebook. So on Facebook, if you are in the US, sometimes you may see our ads to participate in a study. And we asked them to install WebMonk and keep it installed for a few weeks, okay? Between 6 and 8 weeks. We have about 3,000 Amazon searches by 180 users. This data is based on pilot studies. We now have the full experiment being rolled out right now. We have about 900 participants enrolled as we speak. And what we know about these Amazon searches is quite interesting to identify how search results and their positions are very key for product discovery. So about half of the product pages on Amazon that anybody sort of organically reaches, they are reached through a search results page. Only 11% of those product pages are reached from outside of Amazon. So Amazon is a pretty enclosed ecosystem that allows you for product discovery. It guides you, given their results, it guides you to certain products that you may ultimately end up purchasing. And the position of those products is particularly important because users in these searches, they don't click past the first page. And I should say, these studies are done on computers. When you go on mobile, which we cannot act upon, I presume that the results may be even more striking. And half of the products on a full results page are not shown, are not visible to the consumer because the consumer doesn't scroll past about half of the products shown. Okay? So Amazon has a very important role in playing in sort of showing the products that you may ultimately decide to choose. And so these kind of data can actually allow us to explore how Amazon rank products. We have their rank position, right? Rank 1 is the top product that's shown on the top left of the page, and then we read it like a book, and we can see what type of characteristics are predictive of sort of top ranks, right? And the usual suspects are there. Prime eligibility is a very strong predictor of higher positions. You can do these in sort of standard linear regression models. You can do these in machine learning models. The stronger predictors are always the same. Prime eligibility is there. The number of ratings is a strong predictor of high positions. Curiously, the average rating is not. Maybe it's because most of the products tend to be highly rated. And also price is not a huge predictor of the position on the search ranking. The best seller badge is also a very huge predictor. And I should emphasize that prime eligibility, is also part of fulfilled by Amazon, because fulfilled by Amazon makes it more likely that you are prime eligible. And the best seller badge is something that Amazon chooses autonomously, and that affects the ranking. Finally, thankfully, sponsored. If you pay to be put on the top results, you are actually put on the top results. What is interesting is that Amazon brands for example, Amazon Basics, are also shown in the top results, even conditional on all the other characteristics. The priority given to Amazon brands is about 30% as large as the priority given to sponsored products. So if we take these as self-preferencing, and I would not want you to, but if you take these as self-preferencing, it basically means that Amazon gives itself 30 cents on the dollar that advertisers spend to be given priority in the search results. Why do we care about this, and why don't I think it's self-preferencing yet? Well, we care about this because the Digital Markets Act really has, as one of the obligations that applies to these gatekeepers, is no self-preferencing. And this is part of the sort of fairness and equality theme that Jean was discussing earlier. So we are asking digital platforms not to self-preference. But what does that mean? Empirically, it's actually very hard to detect self-preferencing, and it's actually very hard to correct for it. Why don't I think the priority given to Amazon brands that I showed you before is not evidence of self-preferencing? Well, this is basically a coefficient that is the unexplained component of why certain products are at the top of the page. We have characteristics, sort of static characteristics of the products. We have their ratings, we have their price, we have their stock availability, and so on and so forth. But we don't have behavioral information, behavioral data of how consumers behave when they click on these product pages. We don't have conversion rates. And those conversion rates may actually explain why Amazon products are ranked where they ranked. And that, I would argue, is sort of consumer enhancing rather than consumer harming. So how do we test for self-preferencing? Well, Walt Fogel and Aguiar and other co-authors do actually have a pretty simple test that can be done with observational data, where a platform, they use it in the Spotify, in the sort of music streaming platforms. And what they use as a test of self-preferencing is that a platform is biased in favor of a product if the product attains smaller success conditional on ex-ante assessment. So conditional on having the same ranking, if a product is actually less likely to be chosen, to be purchased, that would show that the platform is favoring that product by putting it higher up than it deserves, okay? We can do this. We can't do that with the data that I showed you before. Why? Because one thing that we discovered, and maybe I should have known this ex ante, given my doom scrolling behavior before going to bed, is that people search a ton and buy very little. And so we didn't have in sort of the pilot data a lot of purchases that we could do this type of study on. We didn't have a lot of demand, basically, right? So what we've decided to do is to change the experiment a little bit in a second pilot and ask participants to perform incentivized shopping tasks. So we ask them to sort of pick products in predetermined categories. These categories, we've pre-selected them so that we ensure that Amazon brands are actually part of the results, of the choice results. We asked them to pick one product to add to these Webman wish lists that they created. And again, this wish list is on Amazon, right? You've probably created wish list. We asked them to create a wish list on Amazon. We asked them to search for products on Amazon. And we asked them to then share that wish list with us so that with a pretty high probability, 1 in 3 chances, we buy a product on their wish list. And we give them the difference between $50 and the price of that product in an additional sort of gift card. How much time do I have? Perfect, perfect, okay. So this is our way to make this incentive compatible and to sort of collect a lot of choice data that we can do stuff on. And so one thing that's actually interesting is that Amazon branded products in these type of searches are about 4% of the products listed, but they're twice as likely as to be part of the eventual set of chosen products. So Amazon branded products are actually better than the average product. That's probably not surprising. They're not just better in the choices, but they are better because they have lower prices. We can sort of test that, right, with the data we have, conditional on all the other observables. They ship faster, and they have way more ratings. Not higher star ratings, but way more ratings, about 3 times as many number of reviews as other products shown in the same search results. So we can use these data. Now we have, we have the product rank and we have demand, whether the product is picked, to sort of run these tests on these data. And so we are going to have a dummy for whether the product is selected, and we regress it against the rank. We would expect that as you go down the list, so as the rank increases, as you go down the bottom of the page of search results, the product is going to be less likely to be selected, right? And if the platform is biased in favor of Amazon brands, we should also expect a negative coefficient on these Amazon brand dummy, all right? What we find? We find that rank is predictive. These coefficients seem small, but remember, we pick one product out of an average of 50 products, so the baseline probability is 2.2%. So this coefficient is a 10% reduction in the probability of being picked as you go down one position in the search results, right? So these are pretty large coefficients. And what you see is the Amazon brand is actually not statistically significant. If anything, it's positive. And actually, when we add some level of heterogeneity here, we see that for Amazon brands that are actually high at the top of the page, right, if anything, the platform is biased against them, because conditional on the same ex-ante assessment, they are more likely to be picked than comparable alternatives. Okay? So this is sort of, if anything, and again, this is preliminary results. We're still collecting data. So please don't email me in a month to double check that this is true. But if anything, the test is showing that the platform is neutral or biased against Amazon brands, rather than, the self-preferencing that we feared at the beginning. Why do we care about this? Well, we care about this again because self-preferencing is banned. It seems like an innocuous prohibition, but when we start going in deep and try to detect it, we realize that it's actually very difficult to detect, and it's actually very difficult to correct. And even if we were detecting it at a static level, right, with the data we have, there's a lot of worries about dynamic self-preferencing, which could be difficult to detect in a cross-section. So think about sort of initial sort of launch strategies that Amazon may adopt to increase the number of the early purchases that then lead to sort of positive reviews or many reviews, that may actually be much harder to detect in a cross-section, because many of these products have already been launched, have already accumulated 3 times as many ratings as the alternatives, okay? Just some descriptions of what we're doing with WebMonk sort of going forward, or literally as we speak. I didn't really tell you about how we're using WebMonk to run online experiments, but what we're currently doing is actually we are able to modify these search results and actually change the type of products that consumers see when they search for particular products. So think about 3 groups of people, 3 groups of people that search for batteries. One group of people, our normal control group, is going to see all of the products. One treatment group is going to see no Amazon brands, so they're sort of going to disappear. It's actually conceptually pretty easy because we're simply modifying the HTML document, right? So we're taking out parts of the HTML once we identify that part that we need to take out. But once we take it out, it's pretty seamless. And from another treatment group, we can remove sort of a random set of product to use it as sort of a placebo group. We can also, going back to Jean's temptation to look at the results of the Toulouse rugby team and accepting all cookies immediately, we can look at sort of how choice architecture changes the choices that we as consumers make. Oftentimes, I've seen these changing actually over the course of the last 6 months or so, but oftentimes the default that many of these platforms allow us to choose is accept and continue, or customize, and if you choose to customize, good luck understanding what they're telling you. Well, what we can do is, we call this cookie manager, but it's, again, it's a web monk. We can ask people to make choices as a function of the options that we give them. This is gonna be replacing basically the banner that Amazon is gonna show, or the banner that newspapers in Europe are gonna show. But it's going to allow us to see how people make different choices as a function of the options that we give them available. Not only that, because we're tracking their activity, we can also see what is the downstream effect on the type of ads that they see. Again, I wish I had more results to show you on that, but it's in progress. So let me conclude by saying that, again, digital platforms are huge information aggregators, and these has benefits, but may have some costs. I think it has benefits from a consumer protection standpoint, because we can think about regulation with platforms data. But we also have to think about it from an antitrust perspective. And you know, Jean had sent us his slides. I finished mine, and then I compared the conclusions, and that word exciting was in both of them. And I hope that really you come out of this session being excited about studying these type of platforms. But we have to be very creative, especially if you're an empirical academic. You have to be very creative in the ways of collecting data, because it's becoming increasingly difficult to sort of collaborate on topics that may have regulatory implications. And the last thing that I want to mention is look out for these policy changes. There's a lot coming up in Europe. There may be some coming up in the US as well. But let's not just focus on the unintended consequences, because as academics we're very good at highlighting the unintended consequences, but sometimes we need to test the intended consequences. And so with these, I'm gonna conclude, and I'm gonna thank you, and I'm gonna thank all of my co-authors, because this presentation wouldn't have happened without the work of all of these many co-authors in much of my work. So thank you.
Are there questions? No, I think it's better if you speak.
Hi, my question is to John, and Kara can also contribute, but it's about the role of VCs in all these defensive mergers, because a lot of times it is also the case that VC wants you to acquire a firm and essentially makes it just a monopoly to have as many dividends or sort. So if you can say something.
Yeah, on VCs, that's one of the arguments that is made by those big tech, which is that you need an exit mechanism. And we know there are basically two exit mechanisms. One is a sale to a big firm, and the other one is an IPO, and actually the sale to a big firm is more frequent than an IPO. But that being said, I mean, I still don't understand why WhatsApp could not have been sold to any big firm but Facebook, right? That would be my answer.
Yeah, and I think the other sort of thing that you hear in the news is that VCs want sort of fund companies that may compete against some of these platforms. I wish whether there was empirical evidence on that, because that's not my impression at all. Companies, VC investing has decreased in the last few years, but at a more aggregate level, not just for platforms.
Hello. Thank you so much to both of you. If I have two questions, if I can. One for Chiara first. So I really like this idea of having online consumer ratings as complements of a standard consumer regulation. But there can also be a crowd-out effect. Also, just because, for instance, for consumer, we are introducing trade-offs. No? You see, okay, this one has a license, but this other one has much better ratings. So at some point, they are substitutes as well. And the second one is for Jan. I was surprised to see that you were very optimistic about blockchain, because it seems to be right now a bit of because of the implementation issues that it involves, and also anonymity concerns. So any thoughts to transmit that optimism would be very useful. Thank you.
Shall we collect other questions if there are, and then I will ask Chiara and Jean to answer. There is a hand there, and then Elu.
Hello. I have a question for Chiara regarding the first part of your presentation. I was wondering when we're talking about how to use these user reviews or like similar kind of data to aid regulation, is where do you see the role of, or like the potential effect of fake reviews, or like in general how these reviews are susceptible to like many different incentives and motives? So I wonder what your opinion would be about that. And a question, if I may, for also Jean. I was very excited to see your presentation, and it really relates to what I work on. So I was wondering, do you see any parallels with what you described in terms of the regulation of digital markets with the regulation of like open banking regulations that are coming to place in many countries slowly, which are quite similar in the way that they treat, they kind of turn banks into platforms, but the main difference from what I see being that banks are able to charge their consumers beyond the zero lower bound, because they are actually getting like fees in return, not data. So I wonder if you have any comments on what are the parallels and what are the differences.
Thank you. Thanks. I have a question on the enormous amount of data that many of your proposed ways forward would impose on the consumer. So we need to probably process lots of data in order to, for example, do all these comparisons of online information that Chiara was mentioning, or some of the other measures that Jean was talking about. I just wanted to sort of mention a recent line of work which Massimo and I had the privilege to see some days ago by Paul Heidos and Bertrand Khashoggi and co-authors about limited data processing and limited rationality on the parts of the consumer. Can we really trust these consumers to do as much as hopefully we would wish they could, or is there a role for regulation simply because we need to process so much information that it's better to have certain very simple decision rules made by experts, and then we can focus on maybe more things that we need to do in terms of using all these platforms and apps?
Ladies first. Chiara, do you want to answer?
Yes, so these are incredibly important questions. Let me go in order, sort of the trade-offs between licensed and unlicensed. We actually touches a little bit on, can we trust the consumers to make the right choices? I don't know, right? So in some markets, and in markets where actually there's externalities, so for example, the fire hazard to your house in the home improvement categories, for example, is not just a fire hazard for you, but for your neighbors. So even if the person, the individual homeowner is making decisions that are optimal for themselves, they may not be optimal for society. And so in some context, we cannot sort of get rid of licensing and strong regulation for all of the service providers involved. For example, I would never trust a surgeon who hasn't gone through many years of training to put their hands on my head, right? But there are many other occupations or many other settings where the consumer may be able to make their own choices. And it's okay if lemons are there, but people may want lemons, as long as the people who want the pitches are able to distinguish the two. So increasing information is an option, right, to the extent that the consumers can make some of these decisions on their own. The fake reviews question, yes, that's a huge deal. So the moment, you change the system, you also change the incentives. And so the importance of policing fake reviews becomes particularly important. But we are thinking of sort of regulating many of these platforms as utilities. So we may be thinking about regulating the way in which they sort of collect and police online reviews better, for example. They are already doing some things, but clearly we know there's a lot of fake reviews online. And then, yes, I think we do need a lot of data. I don't think, one study is enough to sort of answer many of these questions. There's a lot of consumers that are out there, some of which are in countries where we cannot experiment on, some of which are not even online, some of which who are unwilling to sort of participate in online experiments. But the more we start getting sort of information about how consumers make decisions and whether we have biases that prevent consumers from making the good decisions, I think we need to have more empirical evidence of that.
Can I just follow up on what Elu said? If I interpret correctly, the question is also about the ability of consumers to process information. So one objective of regulations is that the consumers know that they do not have to worry about certain things. So to what extent the kind of analysis you were doing is taking into account this externality, because after all it's an externality. Consumers have limited attention. They know that they do not have to worry about the surgeon not being a surgeon, but they can focus on something else.
Yes, and to that point, we do not have sort of a lot of experimentation on regulation, right? And so those questions are empirically really, really hard to study. But we do have now some more experimentation, for example, on privacy choices, right? In the US, we don't have all of those cookie acceptance policies that you guys have to face here in Europe, and I have to face when I travel to Europe. And so we could potentially collect data, right, from different countries and different consumers and how they perceive the choices that they have to make and how the outcomes of those choices impact them, the type of ads that they see and so on and so forth.
Just to finish on the previous thing, I think the regulator has to make things quite simple for the consumer. I mean, I'm simple-minded and I want simple stuff, and I will include GDPR on that, which is that, I would like to have stronger regulation so that I will not have to ask myself exactly what's going to be done with my data and so on. So that, maybe that's my French background, but I really wish that there were stronger regulation. I think it's very important. I mean, think about banking regulation. It's very important that you know that your money is in the bank, right? That you don't have to spend all your nights studying off-balance sheet and balance sheet activities of your bank, right? To be able to run in the morning. So that's actually quite important, I think. That thing. Blockchain. So there was this question about blockchain. I was a bit optimistic on blockchain. I'm not an expert, to be honest. I mean, I've been very vocal against cryptocurrencies, but that's another issue. That's a completely different issue. Blockchain is a new technology with, yeah, I understand there are still questions about the move to proof of work, to proof of stake, and there's issues with anonymity and so on. At the same time, there are already many issues nowadays on the web about data breaches and all kinds of things. So I don't know, the jury's out in innovation, and probably that will give us ownership of certain things, which could be useful, I think. But what do I know? I'm sorry, I'm not answering your question, so to speak. On open banking regulation, yeah, I mean, same thing. The idea was that you reduce the amount of adverse selection, among other things, so that you can really have competition among banks using exactly the same kind of data. The same kind of issues arise about APIs, how you structure data, what they mean, and so on. And that's going to be very important. I just want to emphasize it should not be asymmetric. So it should not be the case that Google and Facebook actually have access to the bank's data, and the banks don't have access to Google and Facebook's data. And because to know whether you are creditworthy, it's very important that you also have those data. I mean, just look at Ant Financial in China, how well they have done just using AI to grant loans to millions of SMEs. Just AI, they were not even a bank. And because they have access to social network and many other things to predict whether you'll pay back your loan, they have access to your trade behavior and so on. So I want this competition to be symmetrical, and I don't just want to banks. I'm not defending banks, but I'm just saying it's not fair. In the same way that if you were starting to open the health insurance market to Google and Facebook, that will not be fair. Actually, that will not be desirable. That's a different thing. That will not even be desirable because they will scream. They will do scheming. So in that case, I would just prefer to have health insurance, which is provided by the state. Period. But for banks, I'm not sure I want the banking sector to be provided by the state. But you need to have fair competition, and if it's just one-sided transfers, I know the law is not written like that, but in practice, how are the banks going to have access to all those data from social networks and the like? I just have doubts.
Well, I think it's a moment to say thanks to our speakers for their incredibly helpful presentations and for timekeeping.